Yeah. You're listening to Autodesk's Digital Builder Podcast, a show that inspires construction professionals to innovate and use technology to improve how they build our world. I'm Eric Thomas, and I've been working in construction for nearly a decade. And now I have the privilege to sit down with industry trailblazers to hear how they're solving construction's biggest challenges and redefining the future of the built environment. Welcome back to Autodesk Digital Builder Podcast. I am your host, Eric Thomas. Today, we are once again in the beautiful Autodesk Gallery in San Francisco, and I'm excited to dig into the role of venture capital funds in the AEC industry, the role of startups in construction, working with these organizations, and a whole lot more. To help me tell that story today, I'm joined by Alice Leung, principal at Brick Mortar Ventures. Alice, how are you doing today?
I'm great. It's an honor to be here, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been following you on LinkedIn for quite a while, and we hadn't had a chance to cross paths. And I'm just excited that your schedule is open. You're able to come down and chat all things VCs and startups. I lived in the Bay Area for a number of years and, of course, worked at PlanGrid prior to the Autodesk acquisition. And startups have been, near and dear to my heart for a very long time. And so I'm excited to get your perspective. Let's jump straight in. I want to know more about Brick Mortar Ventures. I've never had a VC on to talk about anything from this perspective. What are you all about, and what's the focus, and how does this impact the construction industry specifically?
Brick Mortar Ventures was founded by Darren Bechtel back in 2015, really with an interest in investing in construction tech. So we call it construction tech, but that really covers, I would say, like AECO tech, if you want to call it that. But it's the overall construction process. Darren saw an opportunity where the industry is slow to change. The famous McKinsey productivity chart still on every pitch deck puts us at second to the bottom, just above agriculture.
I hate that deck.
I hate it too. And then also the McKinsey construction productivity, it's kind of going up and then it's kind of stagnant kind of thing. We need new charts, first of all.
Those aren't true anymore, I don't
They're
think.
definitely not true anymore, but construction is changing, right? And I think at that time in 2015, there was almost this new crop of startups that came out of Silicon Valley. A lot of those were founded by people who knew construction, saw an opportunity to really take advantage of, I want to say digital job site. I think that's probably the first idea that came into construction that really got people to think about how do we leverage, I would say smart devices or mobile devices out on the construction site. So I would say there's been a lot of architecture and engineering tech for a long time, but in terms of construction and the field, it really wasn't until we had these mobile devices that allowed us to bring information from the office into the field. So Darren saw, a couple of those companies. He was actually early investors in PlanGrid, FieldWire, LevelSet. So some of the, in 2018, some of those exits. He launched Brick Mortar Ventures as the first construction tech fund focusing on AECO, based here in San Francisco. And what we do is we manage money. So I didn't know anything about the world of VC before I joined. And I was we're just going to invest in startups. But we are money managers and we raise funds from LPs or limited partners. In our case, a lot of large companies or family offices in the construction value chain.
Makes sense.
And we invest into startups. So it's we raise money, we kind of allocate that capital ideally into really, really great startups. And when the startups either IPO or exit through an acquisition or, whatever that path may be, we take some of that returns and then we send it back to our LPs and we take a little bit of that profit.
I love your point earlier even about just the mobile devices being kind of the catalyst for change in bringing this technology out into the field. Because until the iPad, which is, sitting in front of me right now, that wasn't really possible. And it was one of the reasons why PlanGrid was so successful early. And until these pieces of technology existed in the early form that they did, it just wasn't feasible. You couldn't digitize job site plans. Everybody just laugh at you and shake their head. You go, that's not possible. Why on earth would we even try? And I think we went from a moment where there wasn't very much in this area made for construction to almost there's so much now that a lot of the customers of Autodesk and anybody who's out there consuming construction technology can feel incredibly overwhelmed with the decisions that they have to make in really arming their team with the right tech stack to be productive. Because if you bring too many shiny new toys into the space all at once, that's overwhelming too, especially with how much change can often come along with that. So it's an interesting moment in construction, and I'm excited for organizations like yours to help drive that productivity and bring innovation to the table in a way that didn't exist prior to 2015 or 2012 or whenever, that rocket ship kind of started creeping forward. I am interested in hearing a bit more. How did you end up at a VC? I know you worked at DPR Construction for a while prior to, stepping into your role now. Tell me about that journey and what got you excited about, working at Brick and Mortar.
Yeah, it's funny because I think Autodesk definitely had a part in that, because my first internship with DPR, I was the quote unquote BIM turn. So I came in and Durga, who now leads vConstruct in Pune, she was going on maternity leave, and they were like, oh, we need an extra body to go and help run a lot of the clash detection with Navisworks and kind of help some of the BIM coordination meetings. So I sat down with Durga for a week, and then after that, they were like, all right, you're going to go, do this. So in true DPR fashion, it was like empower the next generation to go figure things out, become passionate, and like go do it. That was when I really fell in love with, BIM. Really, at that time, it was still BIM. It wasn't VDC yet, right? So I fell in love with the idea of building something digitally first and then building it physically so that you could find all the challenges, issues, like whether it's with equipment delivery or whether it's equipment access. There's so many things that you could do with that model. And I really fell in love with the idea of, being able to figure all of that out, because especially here in San Francisco, labor costs are so high that it just makes a lot of sense where, a dollar spent on the design and coordination side is really, so many more dollars saved on the construction side. Because I was so involved with that kind of digital and the computer side, I really gravitated towards working with some of the early startups that were coming into the industry at the time, particularly BIM Anywhere. I was really trying to figure out, how do I bring BIM into the field? Because it was like, we spent so much time doing the coordination, putting together all the documents. How do we get this information in the field? And before iPads, like you mentioned, it was like the Panasonic Toughbook, and, we had the things called cows, computer on wheels, and it was speed drive, like going to field and uploading stuff and like, trying to get that updated all the time with like these mega gigabyte files, because this was
still so manual.
Yeah,
you're
exactly.
Digital, but it's still a pain in the butt.
Yeah. With the iPads and everything, it's like, oh, this is great. Like, we need to build more of this like field and office connection. From there, I ended up digging into like laser scanners and point clouds. So I do think, that start on the BIM VDC side really opened up my eyes to a lot of these different technologies. And during my time at DPR, I was very much focused on the operations side. So I was a project engineer, like kind of climbing up that project management ladder. But realized in my career that I really enjoyed the technology side. And although it was incredible, running these projects and working on hospitals and data centers, I was really trying to figure out how to have a bigger impact on the industry. And I thought that with a lot of the processes that I had developed over time and had worked on, I actually really wanted to use technology to scale process. I want to go work at a startup, turn all of this process into tech, and then like unknowingly help people follow process through use of easy technology. And it was through those conversations where, I was doing research on startups, and I knew that it was actually Curtis Rogers, one of the partners here at Brick and Mortar. He was very well connected with almost every startup that was here in the Bay Area at the time. This was like 2018, 2019 timeframe. I was just like talking to the startups, getting really excited about what they were doing, but didn't really find one that was like, I guess perfect for exactly what I wanted to solve. But I had a long list of problems that I was very passionate about. In hindsight, it makes a lot of sense because I was, sitting down with the Brick and Mortar team, kind of unknowingly helping them diligence a couple of startups in that kind of exploration process. So a little bit out of nowhere, Darren was like, hey, do you want to come work at Brick and Mortar instead? Instead of going to work at one startup, you can join us and work with many different startups. And I really love that aspect of it. And with that, I get to, still work really closely with industry. And because we're so sector focused, we have a lot of, I guess, more opportunity to work and do, I would say, some of these like extracurriculars around more for the industry, not necessarily for venture capital, but at the end of the day, it still kind of helps with the overall vision of what we're doing, which is really trying to help make construction more productive.
I love the journey there is so interesting. And I kind of fell into the first startup I worked at where I got burned out working at the general contractor that I was at still, where I was a proposal manager and contracts modifications and all that fun stuff. And it never stopped. It was just this endless march of, okay, here's another RFP, here's two more RFPs. They're all due today. Everything is crazy. And I just got to a point where I just realized I didn't want to do that anymore, even though I still loved construction. And there was a brief point where I wasn't sure what was going to happen next. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And a friend of mine was like, hey, there's this company called PlanGrid and they need a content marketing manager. And I'm like, I don't know what content marketing is, but okay, here we go. And I applied and ended up getting in. And I've learned more about construction in the last 7.5 years, especially in the last 4.5 doing Digital Builder, than I did working at a GC for almost an equivalent amount of time, because I get to speak to people with such a breadth of experience in all different areas, much like what you were talking about, being able to focus and speak to so many different startups. So you're not anchored to one aspect of construction, that you're trying to find more ways to be productive or help navigate new tech adoption. And so that's a really cool journey you've had, where you go, okay, I'm in a seat now where I get to influence all these people. But I think the core of that is really your industry experience is so critically important to understanding how to develop technology that actually fits the way construction works, because it's just so complex that without that perspective, it's very hard to build effectively. How do you identify the startups that you work at or work with and bring them into the fold within Brick and Mortar? And I know you've got an accelerator program. I think it's Formwork Labs Accelerator. Can you tell me a bit about just that journey and how you find the people to, invest in?
I would say like 6 years ago is very different from today. We talked a little bit about this earlier, where I would say like even a little bit before when I joined Brick and Mortar, it was very much solution scarcity. So there were a lot of contractors looking for technology, but there were only so few number of startups or technology companies. Fast forward to today, it's almost like exponential growth with so many of these companies, because software is just getting easier and easier to build. I think there was a company that was founded back in January and already had an MVP in like 3 months. And if you think about it, it's like, that's crazy. And, some of these revenue numbers are growing so quickly as well. So it's definitely a very interesting time now. We do get a lot of inbound from founders. They do, quick Google search, what are the construction tech what are the construction tech VCs out there? You mentioned Formwork Labs. That's another way for us to get access to some of these early stage founders who are looking to either learn more about construction tech or find a program to really supercharge their growth. So a lot of our access to startups have been either direct inbound or from other VCs. So we've got a lot of VC friends who are more generalists. So they're not focusing on construction, but we've built a brand where if they're looking at a construction tech startup and they want industry insider kind of input or something like that, they'll reach out to us. We get a lot of inbound, and we also hear about startups from industry partners.
That makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time, continuously talking to, probably ENR top 100. A lot of those people in the roles of technology and innovation, they're getting, emails from startup, like hundreds of emails from startups on a weekly basis. And it's interesting because now there's so many startups that, you have to figure out, the signal from the noise. And we try to help a little bit with that too on the industry side. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways to find access to startups.
It's very much overwhelming. And I always talk about shiny new toy syndrome as far as some of the construction companies who are trying to decide what to fit into their tech stack. Because as you mentioned before, there was scarcity. When I joined the industry and when you joined the industry, there wasn't anything for us for the most part in the realm of technology in the way we think about it today. And that's what's so exciting, but also it creates a lot of due diligence has to be done on the end of the contractors who are already very busy and have very little wiggle room to stay on schedule and remain profitable. And then also introducing technology alongside that, it is a challenge. And so I'd love it if you could tell me a bit from your perspective, talk about the culture of construction and the way the industry operates today alongside tech adoption. Like what's the relationship between those two in your perspective? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, I think the first thing that a lot of people will probably mention is, there's some funny images online where it's like, if you're too busy, right? And I think in construction, there's so much firefighting that's going on. Like we shouldn't be like that. We should, properly pre-plan. But a lot of the times on construction projects, we get ourselves into that situation where we're constantly fighting fires and you're constantly just working, around the clock. And when you do that, you do miss out on, taking a, 30,000-foot view of that project and understanding or even looking at, what are some technologies that can help. That's definitely one challenge. But particularly with construction, there's been a lot of really, really interesting startups that have come out that are trying to solve problems around, how do we be more efficient on procurement or speed up the whole like design decision-making process, right? So these are all problems that I think are still very much evident in our industry. But the challenge with that is like you can build, the best collaboration software, but it fundamentally comes down to the way that our industry and our supply chain is set up, where, it is a culture of, lack of transparency. I recently heard this term is like mystery is margin. We are very much that, as much as we don't want to say it or admit it. And if we're not, and even on some of these, IPD or more collaborative contracts, like everyone is still kind of thinking for themselves because at the end of the day, like they have to make money for their company.
Oh, yeah.
And along this entire supply chain, it's like, pricing transparency like doesn't really work because people are not incentivized to do that, right? So I think there's a whole kind of game of, how do you find the right incentives? And especially when it comes to technology, trying to solve these big problems within a supply chain, just the incentives may never align. And that technology is really not going to be helpful until we change either, contracting methods or, maybe just like the older generation of people running construction jobs need to retire, right? And I think that's kind of some of the challenges with these technology companies coming into our space is they have to navigate, all of those cultural things that like, yeah, it may actually take 10, 20 years to change. So on the startup side, like you really have to think about market timing, which is really, really hard to do. But, sometimes it really does take a CEO stepping down, from a construction company and kind of next generation leadership coming in to really catalyze some of that like technology and innovation.
I follow what you're saying, though, and there's a lot of trust that's necessary for folks to feel comfortable being transparent with their numbers. And your point about IPD being more open and transparent, not everybody's comfortable adopting a model like that, even though there are a lot of benefits that we can talk about as far as, just that transparency and shared incentive amongst the entire group. But if you're used to the traditional design, bid, build, operate model, and you are not incentivized to show what your margin is because you have to protect yourself. You have to protect your bottom line. And the way our contracts are structured, of course, folks are going to feel a bit litigious at times, and it's going to be very challenging for folks to be transparent. I was, bruised from that problem pretty regularly as a proposal manager because I couldn't get our estimating team to give me the dang numbers to put in the proposal until 10 minutes before, and now I'm dating myself, but 10 minutes before I had to print out 20 binders of it and burn CDs and do all these things where like the FedEx guy's going to be here at 4 and he ain't going to stay. And so if all of this stuff isn't stuffed in a box and ready to go off to the contracting officer when I was doing federal proposals, you lose, you're done. And we spent $200,000 on this bid over the course of the last month and a half to put it together. And that's a big reason why I don't work at a general contractor anymore, is because those deadlines just were so inflexible and so painful, especially when we were still printing everything, of course. It didn't feel good. And I understand why people are frustrated. And so your point about there is some brokenness in the bigger picture of how we go to market as an industry that needs to be resolved. And I'll be candid, I don't know what the answer or how to move the needle and move that forward is. But it is something that we have to keep talking about. And I'm encouraged by some of the younger generation taking the reins to influence some of this change and be a bit more equitable in our expectations. But I think, to your point earlier, our contract models probably need to change to some degree. And the way we think about construction has to evolve in order to, retain everybody staying profitable, but still being fair to all the players on the project and not pushing all the risk downhill and all the other fun things that I think everybody out there listening right now is quite familiar with. It's tough. I want to take a closer look at some of the startups that you work with now. And I'd be curious to hear from your perspective, what are some of the most significant challenges that the startups you work with are facing in their day-to-day experience building for an industry that is inherently so complex and sometimes might not be very interested in talking to them?
Yeah, for sure. The number one request from any startup that we talk to is access to customers, whether it's access to customers for feedback on what they're building or access to customers for pilot projects or literally just like, I'm trying to grow revenue. Like, can you introduce me to these people? That has been around for probably since, the entire time that I've been at Brick and Mortar. For us, because we have so many industry friends, we've been able to kind of help curate some of those startups. And, as industry friends reach out and they're like, hey, I'm looking for a, progress tracking solution or something like that, a lot of the times we'll be like, okay, these are the options. And if we do have any feedback from, other contractors that we know of, or if we have any like specific, I guess, insights around, whether or not you should or should not work with certain players just because maybe they're running out of money and they may not be around next year. We try to do our best to kind of share that, but also stay a bit unbiased unless if we've invested in a company where we have conviction and like, obviously that's, bias because we have and we're like trying to help them grow. So we do try to help play some of that matchmaking. And through our Formwork Labs Accelerator program, a big part of that program is actually getting these startups talking to not just who they think their initial customer is, but the entire supply chain. Because, if you're building a product just for the GC, chances are at some point that technology, you may need to be collaborative with the owner or the trade contractor or somewhere else in the supply chain, right? Or even within the GC, people wearing different hats. So we always try to encourage startups to really talk to as many, like if you're solving a big problem, that problem very likely exists across the entire supply chain. Yep. Where's the best place to start? Which is the best type of customer? Also, like within that customer base, you do also have to figure out, who are those innovators, right? Who are the people who are very passionate about that problem that will actually take the time to sit down with you, explain things to you, and kind of point you in the right direction on like, maybe you should think about it this way, or maybe you should build this specific feature.
I mean, it makes a bunch of sense for everybody to really be keen to get that opportunity to speak with industry leaders. And that's a challenge for a bunch of reasons. One, because they don't necessarily know who to talk to. And it's hard to just kind of, brute force your way into an organization where everybody at that company is very busy. And to that point, I'd love to know more from your thoughts on how can those startups use the time of those people who are willing to speak to them? How do they ensure they're using that time wisely and very effectively? Because I feel like folks, especially if they don't come from industry, they might not understand or realize how precious that time really is. They might not even know what questions to ask to really get to the root of what they're trying to solve.
So the startups should definitely start, first off, talking about the problem at large, right? And even for us from an investment perspective, we always challenge the startups to think about, what is the problem that you're looking to solve, right? Because we have seen so many startups that are, a solution looking for a problem, or is it the hammer looking for the nail, or whatever it is, right? Whatever the phrase is.
The cart for the horse kind of thing, where it's like we're leading with a solution where there might not be any problem whatsoever to even navigate. And the construction industry has no time for that. They go, well, that problem doesn't exist, go away.
Exactly. So there's like some very interesting dynamics here because, if you actually get in front of someone working on a construction project and you talk to them, sometimes it actually becomes a therapy session where the construction professional will just like tell you all the, bad things that happen in their day, all of the inefficiencies, what's really frustrating. And that is actually very confusing for a startup because they could also get pulled into a direction where something seems like a lot more of a problem than what it actually is. And you do have to obviously validate that across, many different construction professionals. Yeah. So there's a little bit of a challenge there, but I think, staying true to like, what is that main problem that you're solving, making sure that that is a problem that the tools to help solve that problem, people are actually willing to pay for that. Because I think once you get to that second step, there's a lot of these tools where it's like, oh yeah, it's definitely a nice to have, not a must have. A lot of this is really on the founders to figure out, are they solving the right problem in the right way? And thinking almost 3 steps ahead because, even if you build this product, what can that evolve into? What is the overall, solution? Does it need to be collaborative? Are you only working with one type of customer? So a lot of different things to think through. But the first thing is probably, listening from the customer and truly understanding how painful that is. Yeah. And are they willing to pay money for it? And if not, maybe you should look elsewhere.
I've had this come up in prior roles where we were using one bigger piece of technology and then there was a gap. And so we adopted a second piece of tech that only worked on that one narrow area and solved that one narrow focus. And we loved that tool. But then the other tool that we used released a new feature that made that other tool completely irrelevant. And it's one of those moments where you go, okay, well, why on earth am I going to pay extra money? Now I have to figure out an integration to make these tools work together where I can just keep using what I'm already paying for, probably the most for, and this is eliminated. Now this startup has a big problem because everybody else is very likely using whatever other platform or management tool that we're thinking about. And so it's a very complex nuance. And of course, the expectation is always to grow, and that's challenging for any business. But I love that perspective. I'd like to take a look at it from the other side now. So I think our audience, more importantly, might be interested in working with some of these startups in an advisory role or having the opportunity to influence some of these choices. And I think any good technology provider, if you're already working with them, should be open to feedback to some degree anyway. There should be an open door where you go, I use your tool all the time, and this is the thing that makes me mad. Like, let your providers know that's important. But how does somebody go out and find new companies that maybe are working on something new where early advice would have a big impact? What does that look like from your seat?
Yeah. So I would be more than happy to introduce whichever construction professional that wants to do that. So feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn or wherever. I love doing that. And it is a big, I guess, passion of mine is connecting industry professionals looking for solutions with startups that are solving that. But on the earliest stages, right? So with the Formwork Labs Accelerator program, we pick the 5 startups every year. And usually the mentors that we get for that program, they're people who want to work with startups. They want to give back to the community. And they like to advise and mentor and all of that. So I think it's great. And we have seen over, I would say the last 10 years, more and more construction industry professionals interested in working with startups for all different types of reasons, right? So some of them, they're genuinely like, just, I need to find a solution to this problem. Like, this is just, I'm ripping my hair out, right? And then some of them are actually interested in getting involved with the startup community, or even they're curious about venture capital, right? So there's a lot of different reasons as to why construction industry professionals would want to work with the startups. And of course, with the new, I think this is becoming a bit more transparent, but probably still not transparent enough, is, with a lot of these startups, there is opportunity to either invest or become a part of that company for upside, right? There is a thing called angel investing, and being in Silicon Valley, it's a lot easier to kind of just be like, oh yeah, like you could just angel invest, right?
Yeah, these are terms that I'm very familiar with, having lived in the Bay Area for so long and just being saturated by startups everywhere, almost to the point where it can be exhausting at times. But I think if you're not in this area, this is all entirely new as far as a concept. Could you get a little bit more into what angel investing actually is?
Angel investing could actually be like by the individual or even by companies, right? So really, angel investing tends to be like the first capital going into a startup, whether it's friends, family, contacts, or even like early customers. That tends to be that stage. Nowadays, the terms angel round, friends or family round, seed round, Series A, Series B, like those definitions are actually always constantly in flux. And what that means here in Silicon Valley is actually very different from what it may mean in Texas or New York, let alone Canada or Europe, right? So
I didn't realize that had a differing kind of impact. I've just been so Bay Area biased, I guess.
In the Bay Area, there are some companies that are raising, $5 to $10 million. Some of their angel rounds are a couple $1 million. Okay. Whereas in Canada or in Europe, other parts of the world, where, money may, be spent differently, talent is at different cost basis, or, they're just a bit more scrappy and they're, trying to bootstrap for longer. Those seed rounds could be $1 to $2 million.
Yeah.
And that angel round, right, maybe, couple 100,000 versus, a couple million here in Silicon Valley. So there's a lot of kind of different things that impact that. But generally speaking, for construction tech, because you don't necessarily have to start a construction tech company in Silicon Valley, because you kind of want to be where your customers are. So in the past couple of years, we've actually seen these startups pop up more around like Texas and Florida, just because that's where a lot of construction was happening. So at that stage, these startups are looking for kind of investment capital. And we are seeing more and more industry professionals kind of writing these small angel checks into these startups. as well as companies. So some of these early customers who are doing, the first or second pilots of these startups, if they think it's really interesting and it's adding value to their, operations and, there's a good ROI, we're seeing a lot of those investments. And I think part of that actually stems from, some of those big exits that have happened in construction tech, like the plan grids and the field wires. A lot of the construction professionals and the companies that have worked with those startups like 10 years ago at the earliest stages, they gave their blood, sweat, and tears, so much time, so much passion. I mean, the passion is the most important thing, right? There's so much passion going into these startups. And what happened when they exited? A lot of these people got nothing. These companies got nothing. The people got nothing. So yeah, for me, now as I'm talking to industry professionals, I'm like, if you're working with a startup and they see value in your time, please make sure that you're properly compensated, whether it's with stock or it's monetary, because with a lot of these startups, if they do have that upside, and people don't realize that the customers have the biggest impact on upside, because at the end of the day, the value of that company is based on the revenue. The revenue comes from their customer. So customer is so important. And I'm like, these customers should get some of that, because, when that company IPOs, the people who make the most money are going to be first, the venture capitalists.
Yeah.
Second, the founders, and even some of the early employees don't get that much, right? So, whatever part of that upside that you can get, I think should come back to our industry, especially the people who are just so passionate about the problems that these companies are solving, and they're just giving so much time.
I love that you're pointing this out so clearly, because to your point, the amount of time invested in the care and passion that makes or breaks the success of some of these organizations. Coming back to what we were talking about earlier, if you are a tech founder and you roll into the AECO industry and you don't have any knowledge about construction, if you start talking to industry professionals, they're going to roll their eyes, because you're not even going to have a baseline foundation for what's going on or what problem you're going to solve. And without their guidance and advice, what happens next? And so I think it's entirely fair for those folks who have such an influence on early stage startups and the trajectory and the choices that they make and the way they choose to build out their technology, where if they didn't have your perspective and your peers' perspective to influence what happens next, it wouldn't have happened. It's not fair for them not to be compensated for the time and the investment and the assistance that they've given, regardless of how enthusiastic or passionate about it they are. So I think there's a huge opportunity. And I've spoken to so many people who love getting in the weeds, both, I think, like you mentioned earlier, the therapy session of like, I'm mad about all this stuff. And that's fair. Like, there's a lot of things to be frustrated by. But at the same time, there's a really productive output that can have in a very long-term relationship as the industry evolves and the company evolves and whatever happens next. And so I think that's really important. And I appreciate you pointing it out so clearly. Where do you think the biggest opportunity is right now for AECO startups to fill a gap in the construction industry that hasn't necessarily been fully sorted out? Like, from your seat, like should the would-be founders be paying attention to right now?
Yeah, I feel like I've been on this construction robotics thing for the last couple of years. And I think I'm even more convicted around construction robotics because, with the latest, a lot of the latest developments around AI have just made it so easy to build software, right? So we were already in this like solution abundance era of software technologies. A lot of the incumbents are actually starting to build out a lot more technologies. They're not necessarily doing acquisitions, but now with AI, AI is supercharging those software teams. And I do think, in this world of AI, there's a lot of, small solutions here and there, but it's really hard to get access to customers and it's really hard to get access to data. So I actually believe that, the people who are going to win in this big AI race, a big majority of that is going to be the incumbents, right? Because they already have the customers. And if they're able to just like supercharge their operations or add that like wrapper around whatever to make it easy for their customers to interact with their product, like why would I spend this money for this other AI tool if I need to like port all my data over, help them understand construction, train their models, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the like AI and software space that it's still too early to truly know. So it's a little bit risky to do some bets in that space. Like we're actively looking at AI companies, but we've kind of been pausing here and there just because the funny thing on the internet where with every new OpenAI release, there's like thousands of startups that die.
Yeah.
So if you think about it from that perspective, it's like AI is just changing so rapidly that it's like, at what point are these solutions just going to pop up overnight, right? Like at what point are we really going to have these AI agents so good that I could just prompt it like, hey, help me build a Revit plugin that does XYZ. It's just very interesting thinking about, the construction supply chain, where we're at as an industry, where a majority of the cost is, right? A majority of the cost is labor on site. Yes, there have been upgrades in equipment and tools, but I think we categorize robotics also as a new piece of equipment. But with some of the thinking around these tools, the really cool thing about robotics is we almost no longer have to think about construction that needs to be constructed by humans. And like I was talking to Kevin Albert at Canvas, and this was like super mind-blowing to me. He was like, we can change the process of which we build stuff. We can change materials. We can change sizes of things, right? Because sheetrock, the size of sheetrock 4x8 is because, it's size so that it's convenient for a human to go move it, right? But imagine we have superhuman humanoids or whatever, right? Or even just like a different type of robotics that doesn't look like a human, right? They can transport larger sheets. There's just so many things that they could do, right? So you almost have to like sit back and look at the industry from a high level. And it's like, okay, if we're no longer constrained by the human body, right? How do we optimize building something? We can change material sizes. It's no longer, 50 pounds of concrete bags, right? Like the ready mix concrete, right? From Home Depot. We're no longer constrained by that. And if we can imagine a world that looks like that, and I think we tried to do a little bit of that with DFMA, but I think with robotics, this is like a whole other level where it's like, how do we build buildings faster, cheaper? With robotics, it's getting cheaper. Manufacturing talent is coming into construction, especially on construction tech. So yeah, I'm like very interested in that side of things. Have always been, but like even more so now because it all seems so close, right? We're seeing humanoids. There's more self-driving cars, like Waymos are everywhere here in San Francisco. Sensors are getting cheaper, and robotics and generally the development time cycles are actually like constantly getting reduced. Construction robotic startups that were founded 5 years ago versus today, the time to MVP has shortened so much that, yeah, I'm very thankful, that AI is coming to help with a lot of this as well. But at the end of the day, we have an aging workforce. There's not enough skilled labor. And I'm always just thinking back to, how do we just get better tools for the guys in the field?
Your point, you made one point that I've never thought of in this framing about the material sizing and the way that things are packaged or used very specifically because a person can manage to move it around. And I think that's such an interesting aspect to think about in regards to robotics, because what if we blow up all those constraints now and we just think about it from, okay, like the superhuman, whether you're wearing like I know there's exoskeleton suits and things to make a person more strong and safe and everything else, or alternatively, a way to move and manage and navigate and then install the material that we've never thought about before. And so that's really cool. And I just love how we're slowly scaling where some of the more manual and admittedly quite dangerous work too is starting to be automated or augmented with robotics and robotic technology. And I think this materials aspect that you've just kind of enlightened me on as well is kind of an extra really interesting layer. I'm going to have to go down this rabbit hole now and start investigating, because that's really neat. And I think there's a lot of folks who aren't super nuanced in a lot of this technology who have a bit of a fear where they go, well, robots are going to take my job, or AI is going to take my job. And my take on that is still always, it's not going to eliminate jobs. We have so much work and so many things that need to be built and renovated and retrofitted, and not enough people to do it. What these different technologies are going to ultimately do is change the way that we get the work done. It's going to change your job. You might be managing robots now instead of carrying drywall yourself, 100%. Which sounds great, quite frankly. Yeah. Like I don't want to be dragging sheetrock around. And so I think once we start becoming more accepting of these technologies, and also they've been proven out in a way that makes companies feel comfortable adopting them, because I don't think construction companies like being first to the finish line with tech adoption sometimes, but they go, all right, we're going to let the bigger company prove that out. And once we see that it works great, hello, Mr. Mid-market company is going to go, all right, cool. Like I'll adopt that now because I know it works, versus, being the first one. There's risk, I think, in that. And of course, construction companies are risk adverse for very understandable reasons. I love this talk track here. And I think we got into artificial intelligence a little bit, but do you have any more thoughts on AI specifically, especially regarding like, what do you feel is really real right now and what still kind of feels like hype?
Yeah. So I think today, what's real is still anything around like text, natural language, so a lot of what works today is, very much like how you would interact with ChatGPT and what you could do with ChatGPT. So I think and a lot of that draws from, I would say, like PDF documents that are more word-based. I think the latest developments have been around, photos and videos and all that. For me, because I've always loved the digital 3D kind of BIM space, I'm still looking for those technologies that can, understand 2D plans to auto-generate 3D models or, understand point cloud data to, be able to compare these points to an actual object to do that kind of, recognition. So there's still a lot of those technologies that are, I think, need a lot of research. I have no idea when or where that will come, but if we could kind of encourage PhDs to go do this type of research, I think for us, particularly in the built environment, anything interacting with the physical world or the 3D space, I think is still very much a challenge. Understanding drawings is still very much a challenge. I think we've seen a lot of companies that are like, give me your documents, give me your drawings, give me your specs, give me your contracts, and I'll help you understand it. I think the complex thing about that still is the computer doesn't really know, what is the right information, right? Like they could give you all the information.
Yeah.
But even in PlanGrid, right? Why did we have all of the different sheets and we needed the revision history, right? Because sometimes someone will put a detail on in revision 2, but then it'll disappear in revision 3 and then come back in revision 4 because there were 2 architects that were working on the same sheet at 2 different times in 2 different SIs or change orders or whatever, right? ASIs, however you want to call it. And then somehow they reconverge later on, right? I know that because I'm a human and I know to look at all the different sheets and figure out, which information is relevant, which is the latest information, what supersedes what. But I don't think computers are there yet. I don't think computers will know, oh yeah, this happened on this project and, I should ignore this and I should look at this, right? Today, it's still very much I'll help you find information and maybe try to understand maybe just text behind it and maybe some of the details. But I think when it comes to truly understanding drawings, we're probably a bit away, maybe not super far away because I'm pretty optimistic about how fast these models are learning. If I could just sit down with the AI and it can watch me, go through drawings, I'm sure maybe it could just follow my thought process. And I'm happy to train a model to do it, right? I'm sure a lot of people would. But I personally don't understand the actual complexities behind that.
I think that's so neat. And you're making me think of an example from my proposal management days, which brings in a little bit of just a sad feeling inside where so this is before Word docs and such were cloud-based. And so I'd be working on a proposal, getting pretty close to the deadline. We'd send it out to review for, 4, 5, 6, 7 different executives. And then I'd get 7 marked up Word documents back, all with conflicting edits oftentimes. And technology is not going to be able to parse that and make the decision on which edits make the most sense and where I go, okay, I know Tim always makes this feedback and we've decided this is irrelevant and I'm just going to ignore it. How do you train an LLM to have that human critical thinking aspect to it? So I think your point about just the understanding of the why, where there's a learned behavior that would be very difficult to add into the LLM. But I'll be honest, I don't understand the nuances of this as well. So maybe this is on the horizon.
Yeah.
And, we're going to be surprised pretty soon. And, hooray if that's coming. But I think it's all of this said, it's really prudent to just step back and think very critically about the way we deploy technology, because especially with artificial intelligence, there's still a lot of unknowns. So there's still risks in using the technology. And so be very strategic as you adopt it and make sure you understand, what you're putting in and what you're getting out and the risks of everything kind of in the entire process.
Yeah. And I think we need a lot more training around that with any of the implementation. Because what we're learning is, and we've kind of knew this from looking at, ChatGPT and some of the early consumer focused AI solutions where prompt engineering is very important. for us, I think it's even more important because if you think about the types of people who are interacting with these AI tools, in construction, we have a way wider range of people.
Yep.
And how they speak and say, like we have a lot of shortcuts in construction, right? We have a lot of slang. We have a lot of like words that mean different things.
And those change based on region as well.
Exactly. So it's like, how do you, if I'm, interacting with something that should be, another construction professional or whatever through chat, if I say things in a certain way, like I don't think the computer is going to understand that, especially because like they're expecting you to say it in a certain way. So we have to go through this whole process of like, with anyone doing anything with AI, you almost have to like train them on this is how a computer would think. And this is, their thought process. So if you're asking a question, you actually have to give it this amount of data and you have to structure it this way. And then honestly, for construction, it's like, I don't have time for that. Like, I'm just going to go call up, my MEP guy, to explain this to me or whatever. Like, in some cases, it's still a lot easier and faster to go call up a friend than to like try to explain to a computer, like, here's all my stuff. And like, this is what happened in the last, 10 months. And then now give me an answer.
Yeah, prompt engineering is a skill set in its own, even if you're looking for something a lot more kind of small potatoes to try to get all of this context and project history, of course. I get what you're saying. It's how do you tell it all of the context that you happen to just have because you were there versus just calling your MEP guy and going, hey, dude, like, this is weird and I don't understand. Help me figure it out. You're going to get there much quicker. And so there's nuances and there's areas where it makes sense to use and there's areas where it doesn't. And so I think as we train folks and we really start to adopt these different tools, things will evolve and I think people will get more comfortable with it. Right now, I think a lot of people are also very skeptical, and understandably so. There's a lot of work to do, and the innovation that's happening right now is pretty exciting. But we'll march forward and we'll figure it out. But Alice, I got one more question for you today, and that's what is one tool that you use on every project, no matter what you're working on?
Laser level.
Laser level. Why?
Because I'm a little OCD and I like things to be perfect. So I'm like everything. Yeah, this was like just checking. I did so much field QA QC.
Yep.
And I just wanted everything to be perfect. And laser level.
All right. I appreciate that. I have one. I got it from my dad, and I've only really used it for, I think, hanging pictures, to be honest. It sticks to the wall, and I can get some crazy angles and such. But I admittedly also didn't build my house. So, it makes sense that it's not coming out in that regard. But anyway, either way, I appreciate you joining me so much for this episode of Digital Builder. And of course, everybody out there listening, you've likely figured out by now that I am your host, Eric Thomas. You can find me on LinkedIn if you want to chat, ask any questions, if you've got any advice or suggestions for an episode. I love your feedback. In addition to that, of course, if you could tell your friends, if you enjoyed this episode and all the insights that Alice shared today, make sure you let somebody know. It does us a big favor, and word of mouth is one of the best ways of getting that out. Of course, we appreciate your reviews and all those other fun things on the players. If you're an audio listener, I always beg and plead, head over to YouTube and make sure you check out the video of this one. We are in an absolutely beautiful space. It's worth checking out. Of course, we're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere you get your podcasts. But until the next time, goodbye.